And I think
this you said, well, it's a pleasure.
okay. Acoustic feedback. Yeah. Yes. The PowerPoint has been mounted and it's visible on screen. So I will proceed to the introduction of the next speaker, Dr. Haig Utidjian, who is, besides a choir and opera and orchestra conductor, is a scholar of Armenian chant, and he has followed the track to study on the existing sources in a little more than in speculation that has been a trend in Armenian music history beforehand. And it is really interesting to see how these sources some centuries back can bring very interesting results. And the links to the medieval tradition backwards is still under scrutiny. But Haig has worked a lot with the musical milieu in Constantinople in the 17th and 18th century, and the
18th and
18th and 19th century, and the interaction between the various musical cultures that was flourishing in that period. And he is now conducting a research on these phenomena in under the umbrella of the Portuguese research center CISEM in Lisbon, and which is also at cross-cultural Chant Research Center, which is unique in this. So it's it seems to be a very interesting place. But we are also very happy that you managed to get here. I just arrived from Prague. I will leave the word to Haig Utidjian. Welcome.
Thank you very much, dear Christian. And I'm, in a sense, rather embarrassed and at a very severe disadvantage through having missed the talks prior to my own. And that was not by design, but the vicissitudes of air travel. And I'm especially severely disadvantaged by having missed all but the last 5 minutes of Charles's talk. I say this to set the record straight in case anyone is following. They will say, has this chap arrived from Mars? He has not heard anything that was said previously. I should, of course, remedy my own ignorance by listening with great pleasure to the YouTube recording afterwards to catch up. Ladies and gentlemen, the more punctilious and observant of you will notice that I've slightly changed the title. It was due to be observations on an Armenian source, and indeed that source was from 19th century Constantinople, end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th, a source that I know reasonably well, but my dear friend Dr. Jacob Oley persuaded me or motivated me to go a little bit out of my comfort zone, so to speak. And another fine friend and very fine scholar, the Reverend Dr. George Legian, further encouraged me and gave me some ideas, as a result of which it's going to be observations on several Armenian sources. Although I shall be rather tentative because there is much that I do not know. And moreover, there is much that I hope to learn as a result of what I shall say and what you will be able to advise me at the end of this talk. But my starting point will indeed be, as always planned, the Armenian church musician and theorist Krikor Kabasakalyan, and in particular a book that he published in Constantinople in 1794. And the focus was meant to be his narrative on the origins of the church modes. Then I shall endeavor to explore the relationship of what he has written to previous writings, and this will in turn lead us further into the past to several recensions of comparable texts which are ascribed in Armenian sources mostly to St. Basil the Great, although I'm not aware of anything in the writings of St. Basil that embrace such things. And there's a rather intriguing and tantalizing twist to the tale of all this, as I hope to expound in a few minutes. So our starting point is Krikor Tabir Kabasakalyan, where Tabir refers to the fact that he was ordained into what we would call a minor order, appropriate to church musicians. He was born in Caesarea, as indeed St. Basil many centuries previously, but he was active in Constantinople. His legacy consists of 4 published volumes, and he's associated with 2 manuscripts, one of which was lost during the Armenian genocide of 1915, the other of which is extant, but we do not know whether he copied it or whether it's his autograph, or indeed whether it is just written by someone from his circle. So it is uncertain whether it is his own. I will show you in a moment something about his narrative on the origins of the church modes, and it will be interesting and instructive to compare his treatment with the treatment of St. Gregory of Datev from the 14th century, end of the 14th century. It seems that Krikor has drawn on that, and going back to the earlier source is helpful because the saint is more lucid and more comprehensive, and many of the protagonists associated with each of the modes are individually named therein, with an intriguing preponderance of Greek-sounding names. In addition to a deep knowledge of Greek music, Kabasakalyan also demonstrates a keen awareness of Ottoman Turkish musical traditions and terminology. And I will start by showing you this diagram. A transcription of it may be found on the left. As you see, it is a circle very reminiscent of Byzantine drohi that we find in all manner of Psaltiké, of which we have the foremost world experts in our midst in this hall. The 4 arms represent each of the 4 authentic modes, and the 4 sectors in between the arms each represent one of the plagal modes. If we proceed clockwise from the 12 o'clock position, the following trilingual labels may be found, all of which are in Armenian script. The abbreviation for each of the 4 authentic modes is followed by the Armenian name for the corresponding material element: soil, water, air, fire, followed by the Greek equivalent of that word in Armenian Noter-Kir script, and then in a perpendicular radial direction, the names of a Turkish makam appear in the case of each of the arms of this cross. So the central axis of the diagram provides the name of Ottoman makams Yegyah, Dugyah, Segyah, and Chargyah, which designate respectively first position, and position here means degree or mode. I'm grateful to Jacob Oli for this information. So first position, second position, and so forth. However, it would behove me to stress that the musical modes indicated by these Ottoman names do not correspond at all to the musical properties of the four authentic modes of the Armenian system. So they must have been chosen by Kapasakalian for their symbolic use rather than any descriptive purpose. Now, to continue with what Kapasakalian does, he refers to a certain Stephen, a musician, which in Armenian circles has been conflated with Bishop Stepanos Sunetsi Stephen of Sunik, who is indeed credited with the organization of the Armenian hymnal, and he was very much steeped in Greek culture. He translated a very Hellenistic translation, actually with a lot of calques based on the Greek original. He translated the Corpus Areopagiticum into Armenian, for example, and much else besides. So Kapasakalian refers to A. Stephen, animal noises, various mythological figures, the first of whom is called Timgianos in Armenian, and others, who derived the modes from nature: wood, wrought iron, currents, and waves. But he also goes back to the earliest Armenian Christian source of which there is a written record, namely the Catholicos Saint Isahak Bartev from the early 4th century. And he says the modes came from heaven and the celestials, earth and the terrestrials, sea and marine creatures, air and the airborne, and those who have an essence over and above the four elements, namely the angels and man. So Kapasakalian attributes this to Saint Isahak Bartev from the 4th century. He also says, and there are 10, because he counts the 8 modes and their sides, that is the plagi, the plagal modes, plus 2 asteries. The asteries are particularly ornate forms that are associated primarily with the 4th plagal mode in the Armenian tradition, in the past evidently with more of those. And so he arrives at the figure 10, which he wishes to do, because he wants to say that, look, so there are 10, just as the 10-stringed lyre with which David used to sing the Psalms. There are antecedents in some of these things in 12th, 14th, and 15th century Armenian theologians. Greek thinkers are mentioned, although not in connection particularly with the origins of the modes, although there are Greek-sounding names, and I hope that I shall learn more about those as a result of this discussion. Finally, I should like to say that my main interest in Kapasakalian has been due to his attempt to create and to promulgate 2 different hybrid notational systems that in various different ways that we do not fully understand combine the Middle Byzantine neumes, at least the signs for some of those neumes, with some of the, by this time, already incomprehensible Armenian neumes, which Christian and I have struggled with, but it's not entirely clear what he has done. But a very interesting fact is that in the same publication, this 1794 book, towards the end, there is something that is, in fact, none other than the Middle Byzantine notational system, with which he has written an Armenian contrafactum that he has devised himself, evidently. And fortunately, overleaf, there is the Greek version in Armenian transliteration, which is an Irmos by none other than Petros Peloponnesios. And for a very, very long time, no one could recognize it or decipher it. And there are 3 reasons for this. One is that Kapasakalian understood the Middle Byzantine system well, evidently, but he wanted to save money. So to minimize the number of littera, the number of types that needed to be created, he simplified the system, but he eliminated some of the group signs. And so much of what he does is at variance with the grammar of the Middle Byzantine notational system. But he did it skillfully in such a way that there would be minimal loss of information. It is that from which we know that he understood the Byzantine system. But it is not the standard Middle Byzantine system as it stands. The second reason is that though Gábor himself understood the system, his printer most decidedly did not, and there are so many mistakes. He improved as he went along. So the Greek version is a little bit better than the Armenian version. But to this day, when I try to show off by singing a little of the Irmos with Armenian words, which is very surprising, particularly to Armenian audiences, I stop before the end because I still haven't managed to work out what syllables to associate with which melismata, because the printer is all over the place and there are several different possible versions. I digress, but I merely wanted to stress the fact that Grigor Gábor, particularly in the crucible of the Constantinopolitan, culturally very rich environment with mutual interactions, was very much steeped also in Greek culture, and he seems to be very knowledgeable indeed. However, I have only given you an outline of his own narrative. I shall look at the fuller version that we find in the late 14th century Book of Questions, a very scholastic work of an encyclopedic character, a very, very fat volume indeed, written by Saint Gregory of Datev in the monastery of Datev that still exists in Armenia at present. So it's all question and answer. So the question is, who discovered the voices? The voices, it's equivalent of ichi in Greek. In Armenian, it means voices, it means sounds, it means modes. And of course, some of you, with good reason, choose to distinguish between modes and tones. In Armenian, the same word, tsank, is pressed into service for both, although even though I shall try to demonstrate in a moment or two, both functions are very much evident in Armenian liturgical practice. In other words, there are certain categorizations by mode that do not seem to have any musical implications, but they're just organizational, as well as musical tones, very, very musically. So, the saint answers, they say that Stepanos, a musician, divided all the voices among the existents into 26, which are bleating, moaning, lowing, all sorts of animal noises in a similar manner. And this Stepanos, which is Stephen, made 26 diverse instruments, and with those he would sing. And again, we come across this Timgianos. This Timgianos made an instrument and 26 chords. And after him, musician Tovnas. Now, Ov in Armenian usually corresponds to Omega. And the T would be theta, so it might be Thomas, but it's not Tovmas. It is Tovnas. So Thonas, unless it's a corrupted version of Thomas, would put together an instrument in a different way, such that the voices of all the animals would sing through it. And after him, and this name appears again and again, Sinigris, created the first voice found from the arts of carpentry. Then his brother, Phokylidis, by the way, that T ought to be a D, I apologize. Phokylidis, so there would be a great delta there. And this pure letter in Armenian corresponds to a phi in Greek. So Phokylidis, created the second voice from the craft of blacksmithery. Then Sophocles, their brother, discovered the third voice from the currents, and then Papianos, their nephew, created the fourth voice from the waves of the sea. And then kinos finis. I'm Grecizing the pronunciation, hoping that I shall render these things recognizable, and you will immediately jump and say, oh, we know those gentlemen. Expert in the sounds of beasts and birds, separated the side of the first voice. So, prodosplaios, we would say. Then Achillevs, excellent, we know that chap, separated the side of the second voice, which is called the senior side, and then that of the third, which is called var. Var means glowing, but it may also have something to do with varis. Then nominos separated the side of the fourth voice, which is last. But then archelaos, archilaos, in turn purified all that he learned from marine creatures. And some who are called Theophilians, created the two asteries. These are the highly melismatic and ornate versions of modes, as they are known, and thus the 10 voices were completed. Then there's a more biblical account that refers to David, Asaph, Ditham, cymbals, and so forth. And I will now juxtapose next to each other Gabasakalian's information on the left-hand side and St. Gregory of Datev's on the right-hand side, which is much more concrete and gives us more names, whereas the impression left by Gabasakalian is that the carpenter has had a brother, and that brother did virtually everything. And then there was some musician well-versed in animal voices, and he dealt with all the plagi, all the plagal modes. Now, I have just a couple of brief comments on Gabasakalian before we say goodbye to him for our present purposes, because there are others we wish to meet. He is a kind of summing up of Armenian sacred musicology, but there were precedents. There was St. Nerses of Lambron in Armenian Cilicia in the 12th century, St. Gregory of Datev, whom we have seen, his pupil Arakel of Synik. Then in Venice, I say in Venice, where are we? We are in San Lazzaro. So we are indeed in Venice. A stone's thrown away in San Lazzaro. There's a fascinating manuscript called a multi-thematic treatise by an anonymous writer called Voskeporig from the 16th or 17th centuries that also has a musicological section. And there is Khachadur Ezrumetsi, who comes closest to the time of Gabasakalian. Now, I shall in a moment introduce another Voskeporig that is a century earlier than this one. But allow me to say, first of all, my name is not to present or indeed produce a critical edition or to try and create a thorough conspectus of all recensions. And moreover, although 2 or 3 of them have similar names, but most of these sources are mutually unreconcilable. In terms of Gabasakalian, the excerpt that I have briefly outlined exemplifies his more general texts on music, which constitute a culmination of the theoretical deliberations of previous centuries on the very nature of music, its effect on humankind, as well as on the church modes. And readers, in fact, contemporaneous readers in the late 18th century and early 19th century in Constantinople, Armenian readers were baffled by his writings, and there are comments. People complain that his texts were no clearer than the biblical words mene, tekel, ufarsin, as in the book of Daniel. Even Dandesian, the most astute of our musicologists, referred to Gabasakalian's writings as being jabar, a word that splendidly connotes at once a text that is extensive, complex, sprawling, and rather obscure. A further thing that ought to be said, for those who are not aware of it, I hope I'm not boring Christian too much, a substantial portion of this book of Gabasakalian's seems to be a direct translation of a Greek Papadiki manual, written in such a way, and the Armenian is even more obscure because of the losses in translation, written in such a way as to preclude self-tuition. It seems to me serving rather as an aid for those already initiated with the help of a master. At any rate, with the emergence of Hampartsum Limonjan's homegrown notational system, which emerged in the same milieu and at about the same time as the Chrysanthine innovation in the case of Byzantine system, Gabasakalian's attempts were reduced in importance, and he appears to have become rather forgotten. And we have already seen that the book was compromised by printing errors. We find all sorts of inconsistencies in the verbal text as well, and apparent non sequiturs. And serious work on Gabasakalian was undertaken from about 2013 onwards, when I had the very great fortune of meeting Alexander Lingas, Kristen Trölsgaard, and we found this volume rather fascinating for all sorts of reasons. And I translated the monograph part of it, as opposed to the songbook components of it, into English and drew upon it for articles, most recently for Jacob Oley's Global Sources of the History of Music Theory project, held jointly in Frankfurt and in Chicago. One other way in which I've been motivated recently to return to Gabasakalian. Now, I sought further sources, initially motivated by the desire to complete and correct the list of Greek-sounding names, hoping that at least these could be clarified, and also to put, after all, to put Gabasakalian in a deeper context in this way. And I found a paper by Anna Arefshadian, which includes 4 different accounts, the first 2 of which were familiar to me, the last 2 were not. I'll quickly go over the first 3, which may be considered to belong to the same family, so to speak, and then a 4th source that was unpublished until she published it, and which I've been working on and noticing some very interesting things. The first is a Venetian manuscript found in San Lazzaro, of which one of the arches you can see in my photograph on the right-hand side, of which I'm justifiably proud. So in the San Lazzaro catalogue of manuscripts in the first volume by Father Parser Sarkisian, there is this brief passage which he quotes from that manuscript, which is indeed also called Voskeporig. Literally, it means something that has a golden belly. So a kind of anthology of writings of a useful and morally elevating and informative nature. So this is a further source for the same names that we have already encountered. I'll tabulate these in a moment. It's earlier than the other Voskeporig that I briefly referred to. It's in San Lazzaro. And the manuscript is dated from the 15th to 16th centuries. There's no colophon, so we don't know exactly. And we find 26 types of animal noise listed. Needless to say, I could not find English translations for many of those. Some of those I just did not have a clue as to what they were. We shall return to this briefly in order to obtain the various names and compare. There's another version that I did know about by Archimandrite Gomidas, which he published in 1894, but I don't know what manuscript it is from, because he has written, by chance, a manuscript came into our hands with no catalogue number anywhere, provenance or year, and it was reproduced as part 2 of his 1894 article under regarding the voices, from whence they were discovered. And this is now explicitly attributed to the blessed Basil, Basil the Cappadocian, the Caesarian, St. Basil the Great. This lists a mere 24 animal noises and activities, one of which is crawling, unless I'm very much mistaken. And the third source is from a publication by Utidjian, who I believe donated his manuscripts to the Mechitarist monastery in San Lazzaro. So physically, this manuscript is probably also not far from where we are at this moment. But I am using his publication. I haven't checked the manuscript itself. Until recently, I did not know of it. And this time, the attribution is not to St. Basil, but rather to the Armenian Moses the poet father, who may be the historian or the poet Movses Khorenatsi. And there is controversy as to whether it was one person or two persons conflated and which century he might have been from. And so you will find that here we have some very interesting things. So for the first authentic voice, that voice comes from the voice of God, none other than God, when he calls, "Where art thou, Adam?" in the book of Genesis. Or indeed, the same voice when it cries, "Where is Abel thy brother?" to Cain, a little later in Genesis. Yet at the same time, the same mode, the same tone corresponds to the praise of cherubim on earth, or to Gloria in excelsis, as in the Gospel according to St. Luke. So this one mode, this one tone, seems to correspond to rather different situations and rather different sources, surprisingly enough. The first plagal refers to supplicatory prayers. Moses, the testimony of the second tabernacle, the books of Exodus, Numeri, Acts of the Apostles, the Canticle of Moses, the sister of Mary at the Red Sea, the Cantimus, the hymn Incipit, again from book of Exodus, which is all rather strange because, of course, the Cantimus hymns, which all have the incipit, let us praise the Lord, for he is praised in glory. We have such suites of hymns from all four modes. Why should this be associated with the first plagal mode? Particularly, I do not know. The second authentic is to do with a group supplication for the life-giving streams, whatever they are. The chanting of the three youths in the furnace, the book of Daniel, and it's a part that in some traditions is considered as deuterocanonical, but it's very, very important in the Armenian tradition. It being the second authentic voice, it corresponds apparently to double salvation, and double because it pertains to the salvation of the body and to the soul, and also is ostensibly to be sung on the second hour of day. The plagal is the voice of lamentation, in which, apparently, were composed the penitential psalms of the 40 days, in other words, Great Lent, and the Day of Passion. The third authentic voice is also intriguing. It refers to feminine supplications, but also litanies over day and night. And it being the third voice, it pertains to something of tertiary duration. Think of it what you will. The three times of necessity, according to body, breath, and soul. And my good friend, Father George Giragos Lelegian, suggests, because I asked him about these things, he says, according to tradition, the unnamed woman in Genesis 3, who receives the name Eve after the fall, is deceived and tastes of the fruit at the third hour of day, hence the association of the third mode with feminine supplications. The third plagal voice is apparently a joyful voice, whence it is called var, which means growing, but rather different to the Greek varis. In it were composed psalms on the day of Palms, Palm Sunday, the entry of Christ into Jerusalem, the praise of the children, and the Benedictus. The fourth authentic voice refers to general preaching, the four corners of the earth, according to the four synods. Now, this is intriguing because the Armenian Church recognizes 3 synods and not 4. So something there is not quite right. And the 4 elements of which, as we all know, man is composed. The fourth plagal voice is also a joyful voice. In each were composed the storoki psalms, which is a corruption, no doubt, of stichologia in Greek, for Holy Pascha. Now, I shall say something about stichologia a little bit later. When we turn to, let us continue briefly with this account. It is rather longer. There are alternative explanations given. The trumpet of Gabriel, the times to come, associated with the first authentic voice. Interestingly, here we find listed the first authentic, second authentic, third authentic, fourth authentic, and then the plagals. And this is the Greek way of enumerating the 8 modes. The Armenian way entails counting as follows. The first tone is the first authentic voice. The second tone is the first plagal voice. Then the third tone is the second authentic voice, and so on. So already the way this is presented seems to me to be more Greek. Anyway, the second authentic voice, the bridegroom is arriving, come before him, those virgins who were wise enough to have extra oil with them. In the third authentic voice, the prophets burn as weapons before him, and the just will to meet the Lord in the air, and they will be with the Lord forever, which you can associate with the First Thessalonians, but it doesn't quite, it's not quite obvious to me. The court of judgment, or the seat of judgment, and the judge sitting in judgment is associated with the fourth authentic voice. And the plagal voices, the first one, weeping and lamentation of sinners in hell, overflowing river of fire, the second plagal voice. Go, accursed ones, into the eternal fire that is prepared for Satan and his angels. Horror of horrors, the third plagal voice. A very different interpretation of this mode. And the fourth plagal voice, a joyful voice, wherewith are called the righteous. Come, those blessed by my Father, to the kingdom prepared for you from the beginning of the world, from St. Matthew. I will go to the second half of this. Stepanos, the singer and philosopher, is mentioned again. He divided the sounds of animals into 26. Timgianos appears again, etc., etc. And the plagal voices are mentioned, and here we have a whole series of very, very odd words, such as vraimi, Ginosthenes separated the vraimi from pratos. In other words, he's from the authentic voices, he's distinguishing the plagal, or he's extracting the plagal versions from the authentic ones. But there are all sorts of words of very uncertain meaning. If they are Greek, they must have been corrupted quite substantially, because I cannot recognize them at all. And one Archidis discovered brabroro from brid. And he says it's a corruption of the first authentic voice. It's very difficult to discern the original forms also, because the declined form of names in ancient Armenian sometimes makes it difficult to guess what the nominative form was if one doesn't know this. But considerable interest attaches to the end of this text, because Arefshadian seems convinced that there is the influence of St. Gregory of Nyssa, but I read the entire relevant passage by Nissen in Inscriptiones Psalmorum, istas epigraphas ton psalmon, which I strongly recommend because it is an astonishingly beautiful piece of writing. But I could not find, there was just a very, very vague echo, and I'm not convinced of a connection. So the Armenian source towards the end urges man not to use instruments as of old, but instead to let the throat make sounds instead of the trumpets, different parts of the body rather than musical instruments. It's a manifesto advocating singing instead of the use of the instruments, which seems very anachronistic, and you might expect it in some extreme Protestant tradition, perhaps. And apparently, he says this, whoever wrote this, for, he says, it has been written that man is the instrument of praise. Now, here you can see the relevant bit from St. Gregory of Nyssa. Oras don dis arterias avlon, din dis iberoas magada, din diaglotis geparion gestomados, os diachordon geplictru githarodian. Do you see the flute of the trachea, the magada of the palate, and the playing of the harp through the tongue and cheeks and mouth, as with strings and plecters? But St. Gregory does not say you should not use instruments or anything of the kind. And indeed, the previous sentence is Vignisi de tuto, que organigitu somado Simon, dias que vibros ergasian musigis philodechnithisa paradis physios. Because he has been arguing that man and the human body is a kind of microcosm, and he says this too shows it, that the artful way in which nature has designed the human body, it is as if the body was designed for music, for making music. And he's saying, therefore, this part of the body can be made to sound like the flute, and that part as the lyre. So it is a completely different thing. So I'm not sure if there is a correct connection. Whereas the Armenian source is rather different. He says, thus, it does not behove the thalamus of men, whatever that means, or a gathering of men, I do not know, a space where people gather, to have any instrument for songs as of old. Rather, let the throat be instead of the trump, the nostrils instead of the flute, the chin instead of the cymbals, the tongue, and then there is something of which the meaning I do not know, I cannot find it in any dictionary, the entire body instead of the drum, the mind instead of the harp, the soul instead of a lyre, the sensory organs instead of the psaltery. For it has been written that man himself is the instrument of praise. So, although the relevant pages by St. Gregory of Nyssa are most beautiful and inspiring, and I would urge you to read them for the sheer pleasure of it, I'm not convinced of any influence in this instance. Now, I shall, as I promised, consider the names of the personages from the sources we have considered so far. St. Gregory, the Venetian Voskeporic manuscript, Komitas, and Utidjian, and the names do correspond. Some are fuller, some are less full. And we find names, Stepanos, a musician, a philosopher, but there is a Stephanos of Byzantium, according to the internet at least. There is also a Phokylidis, and there is a Timotheos Kitharodos, none other than Timotheus in Handel's Alexander's Feast, when we sing Dryden's poetry when performing that work. So this is my very primitive attempt last night to find any mentions of those gentlemen on the internet. Phokylidis, I see, and Timotheos, and so on. So it seems to me that perhaps in medieval times or older antiquity, some of those characters do exist in the Greek tradition. I do not know of them, and am eager to learn, because it is very fascinating to find out where these things come from. Now, my last source is Arefshadyan's text. She seems to have collated it from 4 different manuscripts found in the Madena Taran. and there are mutually inconsistent associations. Again, so for example, the first voice is associated with the Gloria, but also with the last trump, the Gabrielian trumpet. Now, the interest here is that the various modes or tones or voices, if you will, are associated with particular psalms, particular prayers from the Armenian offices, litanies and ascriptions, and they are inconsistent with the present mode designations, musical or liturgical. So where did they come from? So in the beginning again, now he squares the circle, whoever wrote this, by saying this was by St. Basil of Caesarea, but it was translated by Stepanos, the bishop of Syunik. This way we've covered Stephen the musician as well as St. Basil in a single fell sweep. And there are various liturgical situations mentioned. For example, the second plagal Asterie, the very ornate version of that voice, of that plagal voice, is associated with a hymn for the burial of clergy. Again, we find that part of this text proceeds in the usual Armenian order, and this part of the account, however, deals with all the voices, then the sides. And there's an intriguing mention in the middle of the slide on the left-hand side. You will see the second plagal voice, the Asterie, the ornate melismatic version, sing in a half voice the stologies, the stichologie of 3 psalms. What could this be? I shall omit all the detailed and interesting explanations that I have and focus just on this matter. And I will say something about what stologie seems to mean in the Armenian tradition, so that we can compare and contrast it with the Greek usage that I do not know very much. Usually it means psalm verses articulating the particular theme of a commemoration, for instance, and emphasized in the Armenian tradition through a highly developed musical setting. So, for example, in San Lazzaro, I found years ago a beautiful lectionary copied in different geographical locations, completed in 1335. And for Saturday morning of Easter Eve, this is what you see. Look at the dense... Oh. When did you stop seeing? So hopefully the matter can be remedied with alacrity. But I can talk in the meantime, can I not? To make use of the time available to me. As you will see in a moment, I very much hope, whatever the difficulty, I hope I did not induce it. Yes. So you will find, when in a moment there will be light, that this stologie or stologia, it is in fact one psalm. It's Psalm 77, with a responsorial taken from the 8th verse of it in the beginning, and then the entirety of the psalm with extraordinarily dense numerations, because psalms are not always, sometimes they are just recited in ekphonetic matter. For anyone following remotely, let me stress, this is not part of my presentation. Splendid. This is indeed my slide. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So it starts here. So there's a responsorial, which is in fact the 8th verse, if I remember rightly, and then there's the entirety of the psalm. And you can see the same verse, but numerated differently the second time it occurs. This is a storoki, one of the examples that I know, and it's impressive by virtue of the fact that it is richly numerated. So why a half voice? One would have thought that half voice would imply that maybe one goes over it in a phonetic manner or recites it quietly, but that seems inconsistent with such numerations. And this is the conclusion of it. And then you can see the nice headpiece. This is starts with nocturnes for the day of Easter, the first day of the Holy Resurrection. Now, I don't want to go through details because we do not have time. Let me just give you a little summary of, oh, by the way, there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, etc., etc. But having briefly displayed this slide, those desirous of greater familiarity can then play it on YouTube and do a screenshot and so on. I wanted to give a little summary of some points that I raised in my discussion with Father Lelegian. The interesting thing from an Armenian point of view, other than the delightful satisfaction of one hopes being able to find the Greek origins, or the origins, whatever they are, even when they're not Greek, of some of these rather puzzling Armenian texts, is the following. As I mentioned, the modes and the sequence of the text do not correspond to our understanding of Armenian liturgical practice, by which I don't mean just current practice. I mean the practice as documented from the earliest extant liturgical codices. So, for example, the Gospel of St. John is associated with the first authentic mode and the third authentic mode. Similarly, now, given that what I've presented does not correspond to known Armenian practice, the question arises, is there a correlation to the octoichos of the Byzantine tradition? Is this text attributed to Basil genuinely indicative of the practices of the Greek Orthodox Church? And if so, when was the text translated into Armenian? Now, it seems to me, as far as I can tell, there is a strong case for suggesting that at least some of these references really are Greek, even if they are garbled and eclectic. And Father George Giragos, in fact, suggested to me that the three stichologia of the Psalms may be a reference to the Kathisma series of psalmody in the Byzantine tradition. You may be able to confirm this. But if these things are if such writings were spread about in Armenian communities, do they bespeak an earlier Armenian practice that is not otherwise documented, that was similar to Greek practice? Or is it simply that these prestigious Greek sources were translated into Armenian, much as other things? For example, the books of Thrax, grammarians were translated into Armenian, even though the rules of Greek accentuation are not the same as those in Armenian, but it was a very respected Greek text, and so it was translated and circulated in Armenian, even though it had nothing to do with the practices associated with the Armenian language. Could it be that it's this sort of thing? And of course, it would be very useful to know where these, what time these Greek things come from, and what time they were translated into Armenian. And of course, the absence of early sources doesn't mean that they didn't exist. So I fear that I have to end with an open question that I hope you may be in a position to help me answer. I will just end by reminding us all that the relationship between Greek sources and Armenian texts or translations is not always straightforward. So, in the Armenian Missal, for example, there are prayers attributed to Saints Basil and John Chrysostom, of which I have not found Greek equivalents. The lectionary has homilies attributed, amongst others, to St. Basil, John Chrysostom, Syriac saints, which do not seem to exist in the languages from which they are ostensibly translated. On the other hand, we know the syntonization of the homily on the Holy Spirit by St. Basil. In common with Byzantine tradition, there is an Armenian Levavi hymn. You can find an article about this published by Peters, the Radiation volume, edited by our dear colleagues here. There are other examples. There's the hymn Crucem tuam adoramus Hachiko Christos that exists in Greek, in Latin, in Armenian. It's common to Christendom. There are, on the other hand, Armenian translations from Greek by writings by Philo of Alexandria. They are authentic and they have been preserved only in Armenian translation. And so it's difficult to know what to think. I'm convinced of some genuine Greek antecedents, and I very much hope that this presentation will help identify some of them. Also, in the catalogue by the late Venetian Mchitarist, father of San Lazaro, Father Sarkisian, he mentions Epiphanes the Cypriot and Athanasius. So there are some Armenian texts attributed to those. I have not located these. So it would be very interesting to see if such writings reflect early Armenian practice, albeit at variance with that documented by early codices of books of ours and psalters, or whether the scribes merely copied Armenian translations of Greek texts, even though they were incompatible with Armenian practice. If indeed these texts are witnesses of earlier Armenian liturgical practices, then this is extremely interesting, surprising, and it opens a whole new avenue worthy of investigation. I should like to proffer my very sincere thanks to all who helped me, organizations, individuals, Jacob Oli, Father George Leilegian, the Mchitarist congregation in San Lazaro, who unfortunately their members could not attend this evening much as they wanted to, because there's something about St. Thomas Aquinas that is happening, which they are committed to. And for the most pleasant part of my presentation, I should like to offer my thanks to Christian Trosgaard. Christian, as I heard that you had a spot of ill health some time ago. This is a Bohemian elixir that is, it tastes good to some people, but in your case, you are to take it as an aperitif or as medicine. Permit me to present it to you.
Thank you very much.
To Silvia Tessari, who, as well as being a musicologist, is a superb pianist, so I wish to present her with my edition of the 24 Preludes and Fugues by the Czech composer Milan Iglo on Czech folk tune themes. And I am profoundly indebted to the Ugo and Olga Levi Foundation, not only for the present hospitality and kind invitation, but perhaps Signora Campanella does not yet know that back on the 3rd of November 2016, I was here, but on the ground floor in the library, and I was treated with very great generosity and consideration by the staff, who very kindly made available to me manuscript material pertaining to the Venetian composer Pietro Bianchini, who is one of my research interests, which was of very great value to me. So I should like to present to Signora Campanella this volume, of which a substantial portion is devoted to Bianchini, because Bianchini transcribed the chants of the Mchitarists as well. So allow me to express my gratitude through this means. Thank you very much indeed for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes my talk.
Thank you very much, Ike. We really appreciate that you took up the challenge to go into the research on the prehistory and the concept of modes and the philosophy of modes in the Armenian tradition, even if you did not work so much on that earlier. And this is a challenge that you took up, and I think it opens up a really interesting range of sources, even if we have no final solutions on many of these problems. I think these sources reveal some parallel thinking and some perspectives on the concept of mode in other traditions. So please, questions, comments for this? I could start with one. Did you run into mention of the humming of bees? You mentioned.
I do not recollect having done so.
No, but animals, no insects.
It is possible that one of the various noises that of which I did not know the meaning could conceivably belong to an insect or a bee, but it is not a standard word. It is not to be found in the big Venetian dictionary of the three Archimandrites published in Venice in the early 19th century, and is not known to me. No. So I cannot preclude it, but I can only say I myself have no knowledge of it.
No, but you mentioned all these
they seem to be larger mammals for the most part, you know, cows and
oh, it was just an opener, so you could think
Are
about
what important in the Greek genealogy of the modes.
Could be that the humming of these sweets could be a kind of a sound of the Aeson singing, the Aesoplatima.
That's what my mind went to, because the drone, the word drone itself
could be pointing in that
direction.
Who knows? But that was just to make your thoughts walk around, if you have no. I would say that Sandra, it's interesting for these descriptions of the modes.
There are some insects that
and cicada.
Yeah.
I don't know if
I will have to look at those unknown words and see if I can somehow decipher them. But my attempt so far did not succeed, but it's quite an intriguing thought, and it doesn't seem to be unlikely. I mean, it is quite considerable. Some of the words may be a little onomatopoeic, so
yes, think about it. I have another question. Also,
but you said that the Armenian modes don't correspond to the Byzantine modes. I was going to ask, you know, the Haig Utidjian says that in the city of Jerusalem, there were, in the Haig Utidjian there were 10 modes that were sung. I'm just curious, had you looked at the Haig Utidjian? It's a terribly confused source, but I'm curious as to whether you looked at it and whether there could possibly be
I did not look at it, but it seems to me very, very plausible that could be parallels, because it's rather manufactured. He tries to make it up so that it's 10. The standard is 8, and the Asteri modes ought to be included amongst those 8, because they are Asteri versions of 2 or 3 of the modes. So it's an artificial attempt to build it up to make it 10. I thought the sole motivation was to make it rather like the 10 strings of the lyre of David, but the source that you mentioned could well have been an inspiration. It is not known to me, that source. Good. Thank you. Thank you.
So
the Byzantines add 2 additional indicamata, namely the Nena Novena, and that would to bring it up to 10.
Yes, yes.
That number was probably the reference.
Right.
So I mean, I don't know.
Thank you.
At the end of the same compilation, the Agiopolitis, there is a list of instruments and modes that particularly connect these together, and it could be interesting to see if some coincidence was.
I should like
Yeah.
to see those
It's,
Greek
it's online.
scholars.
It's online.
Yes,
On
yes.
the preliminary edition, which is quite good
Right.
from Jürgen Rostedt. So it's online. I would like to ask you, how could it be that ancient Greek poetry, these names of ancient Greek poems,
The lyrics.
that pop up there. Have you any knowledge of translations of
Absolutely none. Absolutely none. I was just.
I was thinking
I was like a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat.
Archaic Greek poetry and Armenian musical law. I can't really figure out how the connection could
I
be.
had rather hoped or expected that those Greek poets, whose poetry I do not know, and in fact, from what I gather, they're fragments, that these found themselves in Greek narratives of the origins of the modes. And it is from those narratives that they entered the Armenian narratives. Not that I would not think it all that likely that these actual pieces of poetry would have been translated into Armenian and entered into the Armenian narratives that way. But are there not such Greek narratives that involve Hymnianos and?
There are, so Pythagoras and Terpandros and some figures of maybe lyrical poets also will occur in some of the in pieces of musical mythology or prehistory or whatever we could call this. So there might be a field of sources that could be investigated in that direction. But I think it's quite all this material is quite new, of course, since and interesting to see that the way of thinking about this could be compared in many ways. Yeah. Other comments or questions for Haig? You don't have. You have.
Timotheus, Malaysia, is mentioned as one of the 4 creators of music, of the instrument, in chapter 20 of book 1 of Boethius, when he's naming the creators of this, when he builds up.
Yes.
Right. So Timotheus is mentioned.
Yes.
Probably by the lost Peter Musicae of the Economics.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The lost part of it. Yeah. Yeah. So,
well, thank you very much for your patience.
Yes, it was a wise decision to place Haig as the last speaker of today, but we enjoyed every minute. So, thank you.
Thank you.